it is time for the Nigeria term list review. Let's go. Let's get straight into it. Underdeveloped countries. What does that mean? Underdeveloped countries. Nations with low industrialization, weak infrastructure, and widespread poverty. Nigeria, despite its oil, it's classified as an underdeveloped country because of its poverty and corruption. Now, dependency theory. That is basically this idea that the poor countries remain poor because of their economically dependent and exploited by wealthier countries. Now, Nigeria, their colonial legacy and history and their reliance on the oil exports, it kind of reflects like this dependency theory, right? Now, developing countries are countries that are undergoing economic growth, but are still facing these growing pains, kind of like developmental challenges, right? Nigeria is considered a developing country because it is growing, but it's hindered by its, deficiencies, right? A rentier state, we talked about it in the Iran video. A rentier state is just a state that basically just rents out all of its natural, not all, but most of its natural resources to other countries in exchange for revenue, right? And it is a state that gets most of its revenue through this process, right? Nigeria, perfect idea of a rentier state, right? It's heavily reliant on its oil exports, just like Iran. Now, accountability. It's the obligation of government officials to be answerable for and accountable for their actions and what they do. In Nigeria, this isn't really that prevalent, corruption is really, just undermine a lot of public accountability. Now, the jihad is a Islamic term meaning struggle, but is often interpreted in modern day as holy war. Now, there is a militant group called Boko Haram, and they use this concept to justify a lot of their violent acts in northern Nigeria. We'll talk about them a little bit more later. Now, interventionist is a state that actively intervenes in the economy or society. Now, Nigeria's government has taken an interventionist role in both development and security, especially with oil and their counterterrorism dealing with Boko Haram. Now, autocracy is a system where one leader or one small group has absolute power. Now, Nigeria, this is mainly in the past. Before their democratic transition in 1999, this was their way to go, autocracy. And autocracy was really it was kind of thwarted by military coups per se, which we'll talk about a little later. Now, rents. Economic gains from natural resources not earned through production or risk. Now, Nigeria's oil sector generates massive rents. Now, this often enriches elites rather than the general population, which is important to know because that creates cleavage. Now, structural adjustment programs. These are economic reforms that are imposed by leaders that are aiming to stabilize and liberalize economies. Nigeria did this in the 1980s, and it had reduced public services and economic hardships for many citizens. Didn't really work too well for the working man, let's say. Now, international financial institutions, they are organizations like the World Bank that provide loans and economic advice. Now, Nigeria has relied on these institutions for debt relief and economic reform, especially during their crisis areas or periods of time. So they rely on these quite often. Now, balance of payments, that is a summary of all economic transitions between a country and the rest of the world. Now, Nigeria's balance of payments fluctuates with oil prices and affecting currency stability and foreign reserves. Now, Economic Community of West African States, that is an organization that promotes economic integration of political cooperation with the West, or West Africa specifically. Now, Nigeria is a founding and leading member of this, and they often play a very dominant role in the diplomacy and peacekeeping of this, regional organization, which is pretty ironic because they don't handle that in their own country. Most disputes historically were settled through violence, which is very interesting. Now, patrimonialism is a system where political power is based on personal loyalty and patron-client relationships. Now, Nigerian politics often functions on patrimonial lines where leaders distribute resources to loyal supporters and loyal supporters only. Now, prebendalism, that is a form of patronage where officials use public office for personal and ethnic group gain. Now, this kind of explains how Nigeria's corruption and ethnic favoritism, because there is ethnic cleavages throughout the country. Now, in like the political appointments, that's where we see this corruption and favoritism. Now, Sharia law. This is the Islamic legal code that was based on the Quran, and several northern Nigerian states implement Sharia law alongside the civil law, which also shows a third cleavage, which is the religious cleavage between, the Islamic and the Christian north and south. Now, Boko Haram, the official definition, they are an Islamist group that is seeking to establish an Islamic state and eliminate Western influence in Nigeria. Now, they have caused widespread violence, particularly in the northeastern section of Nigeria, and it remains a major security challenge and a major threat in Nigeria. Now, as previously mentioned in the Iran video, Nigeria has a resource curse where essentially they should be really, prosperous with their oil industry. However, they've become so reliant on it that it starts to fuel their corruption and inequality rather than their development. That's essentially what is the resource curse. Now, some political groups and movements include the All Progressive Congress, which is a political party that was it started as like a merger of all the opposition groups of the PDP, which was the long-standing dominant party, and they elected President Muhammadu Buhari, and that kind of ended that dominance that we saw from the PDP. Now, also exists is the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, and as you might think, that is a group advocating for the rights of the Ogoni people and environmental protection, basically. Now, the National Economic Empowerment and Development Strategy, or NEEDS, is a reform program that was aimed at economic growth and poverty reduction in the 2000s. And last but not least, the People's Democratic Party is Nigeria's dominant political party from the 1990s to 2015, and it was split in that 2013 area where Muhammadu Buhari was a member of the APC. But that is the dominant party, and it's kind of become associated with corruption. So a little bit regarding the history of Nigeria includes the Republic of Biafra, which was a state that was formed in the southeastern region of Nigeria in the 1960s, and it was the dominant republic until the Nigerian Civil War that happened in 1967, lasted a couple of years, and it ended that whole Republic of Biafra, but however, these ethnic tensions still remain, basically, in that region. Now, the scramble for Africa was the 19th century European colonization of all of the African territories, and Nigeria was colonized by Britain during this period, which created a lot of borders and ethnic tensions because they introduced Catholicism while the North remained very Islamic, basically. So the Sokoto Caliphate is a large Islamic empire that was in North Nigeria. Now, what I just said, how the religious identities kind of clash there because they are Islamic while the others are introduced to Catholicism because of the British colonialism, basically. Now, the first, second, third, and fourth republics were the different areas or eras of Nigeria's republican governance attempts, basically. And it kept having military coups and political instabilities that kept causing those repeats, basically. Now, for the different ethnic groups, there are the Hausa people, which are the major ethnic group in the north, and they're predominantly Muslim. So then there's the Fulani, which are the predominantly Muslim ethnic group that kind of intermerges with the Hausa. And they have produced several leaders, including President Buhari, and that's their deal. Then there's the Igbo or the Igbo people, which are the ethnic group in the southeastern region, and they are basically they're kind of underrepresented, so they often advocate for regional autonomy, basically. Now, the Yoruba people is the large ethnic group in the southwestern part of Nigeria, and they are both Muslim and Christian. They have both populations. And they are economically significant because they have very good natural resources down there. Wow, that might be a speed run, boys. That was pretty fast. Hope you all remembered all that.